895 feet. That is the exact elevation where Hoover Dam stops working, where the mighty Colorado River stops flowing downstream, where the power grid for 25 million Americans goes completely, irreversibly dark. The government knows this number. They've known it for 20 years. And in 2008, facing a terrifying reality, they quietly began drilling 3 miles through solid volcanic rock, 300 feet beneath the floor of the lake itself, to stop it from happening. They spent $1.4 billion. They spent 7 years boring through the earth. And today, the lake is still falling. But the real threat to the American Southwest isn't just the drought. The real threat is a signature on a piece of paper from 1922, a 100-year-old mathematical lie that doomed 40 million people. Here is what the press releases didn't say. November 1922, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, sat across a heavy wooden table from representatives of 7 western states. Their goal was unprecedented: to divide a river. These were not reckless men. They were engineers, lawyers, and politicians, the most qualified people their era could produce. They brought surveyors' data, flow measurements, and decades of institutional knowledge. They believed they were building something permanent, something fair, something that would hold. They were wrong in a way that would take a century to fully surface. The Colorado River Compact allocated water to Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Each state received its predetermined share. The math was clean. The document was signed. The future of the American West was legally cemented. There was just one catastrophic problem. The hydrologists measuring the river's flow had been working during a massive climatic anomaly. Modern paleoclimate researchers, studying ancient tree rings and geological sediment, now know that the years between 1905 and 1922 were among the wettest in the region's history over the past 5 centuries. The men in that room were measuring a rare, temporary exception and legally classifying it as a permanent baseline. They allocated 16.4 million acre-feet of water per year. The river, in most normal years, produces closer to 13 million. That gap, millions of acre-feet of phantom water every single year, has been accumulating like an invisible, inescapable debt since 1922. The men who signed that document would never live to see the consequences. The people living those consequences today never signed anything. It didn't cause a crisis immediately. It just needed time. It needed exponential population growth, and it needed a sprawling metropolis built entirely in a hostile desert. Las Vegas should not exist at this scale. Consider the geography. Annual rainfall, a meager 4 inches. Summer temperatures that regularly and brutally exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. There are no natural rivers running through it. There are no natural lakes within reach. There are no underground aquifers capable of supporting a metropolitan area of any real significance. In 1940, it was a dusty railroad town of barely 8,000 people. Then came the interstate highways, the invention of mass air conditioning, the explosion of the casino economy, and a particular 20th century American conviction that concrete and engineering could override geography forever. By 2024, 2.3 million people live in the Las Vegas Valley. 40 million tourists arrive every year, expecting towering water fountains, sprawling golf courses, and infinite luxury in the middle of the Mojave Desert. The city consumes 300,000 acre-feet of water annually, and 90% of every single drop they consume comes from a single, vulnerable source: Lake Mead. The entire city was built on the assumption that the 1922 debt would never come due. For decades, the illusion held. Lake Mead stayed full, the compact remained unchallenged, and Las Vegas kept growing in directions that made absolutely no geographic sense. Then the mega-drought arrived, and the debt collector came with it. By 2022, the massive reservoir held just 26% of its total capacity. The white bathtub ring, a stark mineral stain left on the Red Canyon walls as water levels drop, climbed 180 feet high. It stands today as a geological receipt for 2 decades of relentless withdrawal. Las Vegas watched the lake fall toward disaster and made a critical decision: not to fundamentally reduce regional demand, not to renegotiate the flawed 1922 compact. They decided to engineer their way out. They decided to drill deeper. The city's survival relied on 2 existing intake pipes drawing water from the lake. Intake 1, built in 1971. Intake 2, built in 1993. Both become completely inoperable at an elevation of 895 feet. Dead pool. The threshold where water can no longer flow past Hoover Dam. By 2022, the lake was at 1,040 feet and dropping fast. So construction began on Intake 3. A colossal tunnel boring machine, nicknamed Sandy, was assembled deep underground. Measuring 23 feet in diameter, wide enough to drive 2 large vehicles side by side, the steel behemoth was set to work grinding through solid volcanic basalt, one of the hardest rock formations on the North American continent. The work was a brutal engineering nightmare. Sandy broke down repeatedly under extreme pressures the initial models had severely underestimated. Water constantly seeped through jagged fissures in the rock. Workers drilled in relentless heat and deafening noise, operating in claustrophobic spaces while fully aware that an active lake sat directly above their heads, separated only by fractured stone. The tunnel ran for 3 agonizing miles, eventually dropping a vertical shaft 300 feet straight down into the lake bed. It reached a new intake at an elevation of 860 feet, the deepest municipal water intake ever built in the United States. Total cost? $1.4 billion. Paid entirely by the residents of southern Nevada through water bills that climbed higher every single year of construction. It solved the immediate existential problem of reaching water the older pipes couldn't touch. But it did not solve the flawed mathematics of the 1922 compact. It did not solve the river that produces millions of gallons less than the document requires. It didn't buy salvation. It only bought time. Here's what the triumphant press releases did not prominently advertise. The new tunnel reaches water at 860 feet. But Hoover Dam stops generating power entirely at 895 feet. Below that threshold, the massive hydroelectric turbines shut down. The third straw keeps working, pulling water into the city, but Hoover Dam goes completely dark. The city that built a billion-dollar tunnel to secure its water supply has no equivalent backup for the power system required to run the pumps moving that water. And there is a second, darker problem lurking below the surface. As Lake Mead's water level fluctuates, toxic sediment resting on the lake bed is disturbed and remobilized. Decades of mining operations along the Colorado River corridor left lead, arsenic, heavy metals, and industrial residue buried in the mud. The third straw pulls water from 860 feet. Nobody can fully guarantee the long-term quality of what has been stirred up at that depth during decades of severe fluctuation. When infrastructure at this scale starts to fail, the grid doesn't send a warning. It just goes dark. In a desert city without power, the state cannot guarantee your survival. You have to. The one thing I'd have ready before any of this gets worse is an independent power source, something that works whether the grid does or not. If you're thinking about this kind of scenario, I've linked the exact setup I'd personally use in the pinned comment below. It takes 30 seconds to check. Back to the dam. Despite everything, Las Vegas is not the villain in this story. In fact, it is a masterclass in urban survival. Since 2002, the city has reduced its per capita water consumption by more than 40%. They deployed water enforcement officers to patrol neighborhoods. They legally banned decorative, non-functional grass. They implemented a system that captures, treats, and recycles 99% of all indoor water used in the city. No other major desert city on Earth has made cuts this deep while continuing to grow its population and economy. And yet, it is still not enough. Because conservation only addresses the demand side of the equation. The supply side is governed by a document from 1922 that no amount of efficient plumbing can fix. The 2026 renegotiation of the Colorado River Compact will force a brutal conversation that infrastructure spending has delayed for a century. 7 states, consuming water at rates the river cannot sustain, will have to sit at a table and agree on who gets less. There is no version of that conversation where everyone walks away satisfied. There is no engineering solution waiting in the wings. The engineers solved the problem they were given: drill deeper, reach the water, buy time. They bought it. The engineers did everything right. The desert didn't care. If you want to understand what happens to a city when the engineering finally runs out, the next video covers the dam that already crossed that line. Subscribe. You'll want to see this one.